that it would be difficult to prove in a court of law. Right? It would be difficult to prove.
I would say would go with any religion that it couldn't be proven true or false. There's too many variables there, depending on who the judges are, the jury is. It's impossible to put a label to that.
This is where I get the phrase that I like to use. The evidence for Christianity is not exhaustive, but it's sufficient. You say, what do you mean? Well, in verse 30, the Apostle John writes out, he said, it's not exhaustive. Many other signs Jesus did haven't even been recorded. So it's not exhaustive. But he said, these that have been recorded of what Christ did and said are that you might have life and have eternal life in him. So he said it is sufficient for an intelligent belief. So the evidence is not exhaustive, but it is sufficient. They wrote as eyewitnesses. And in Luke, when he starts out the book of Acts, in the first 3 verses, he said that Christ had appeared to the apostles with many convincing proofs over a period of 40 days. And that phrase, convincing proofs, was a phrase of that day of overwhelming evidence in a court of law. And so he says there, look, I'm not an eyewitness, but in examining the eyewitness, they recorded that they lived with Christ, they ate with him, everything, for 40 days after the resurrection. So he recorded an eyewitness account. Now, there's a second part of the writers of the Scriptures. They not only wrote as eyewitnesses or recorded eyewitness accounts, but here is a critical key. In the presence of some of the most adamant, some of the most hostile witnesses, people that disagreed with him, people who knew Jesus, they knew what he said, knew what he did, hostile witnesses, they presented this in the presence of hostile, knowledgeable witnesses and said, you know what we're talking about. They not only said, we saw these things, but in front of knowledgeable witnesses, they threw it back in their lap and said, you know what I'm talking about. For example, here again we'll go back to Peter. In Acts 2:22, he is before a very antagonistic Jewish audience. They really thought that the disciples and the apostles were presenting a false Messiah. And any sincere Jew would have to stand against that. Strongly stand against that. And so they did. So here is Peter before this antagonistic audience. And notice what he does. This here is one of the best preservers of truth. He said, men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, and notice what he says, a man attested to you. In other words, not just to us. He is standing in front of these hostile people and say, look, he was attested to you with miracles and wonders and signs, which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. Well, I'll tell you this. If that antagonistic Jewish audience had not seen those miracles and those wonders and signs, literally everything that Peter was said would have been discounted and thrown out. And he would have probably been lucky to make it out of there alive. But what does history show this happened? Thousands were added to the church. You see, it was presented in the presence of knowledgeable people, where if they would have dared to depart from the truth, the very community itself would have corrected it. They appealed to the knowledge of their opponents. And I know when I go into a debate, and over the years I probably had close to 200 to 250 debates. And I study my opponent's position more than I do my own. I know what I believe. I know why I believe it. I got to find out, why does my opponent believe what he or she believes? And so when I go into a debate, I would constantly turn to my opponent on some point and say, isn't this true? Or you know what I'm talking about. Well, boy, you better be accurate when you do that. It'll be shoved right back down your throat. And you can be right 19 times, miss it once. And if your opponent is sharp, he or she will step up and bury you that one time that you missed the mark, not the 19 times you nailed it. And so the community became a powerful corrector of falsehood. And a lot of people don't realize that. You have in Acts 26, and starting with verse, say, 20, 22, here is Paul brought before the king. And he'd argue a little bit on the deity of Christ, the resurrection. And the king says, Paul, your great learning is driving you mad. Well, they knew Paul had great learning. He was brilliant. And he said, your great learning is driving you mad. And Paul responded to the king. He said, I am speaking to you of words of truth and rationale. For this has not been done, notice what he did now. This has not been done in the corner for the